Because I said what was on my mind. I made a lot of enemies. I made a lot
Welcome, everyone, to Science From the Fringe. My name is Bryce Nickels. I'm a professor of genetics at Rutgers University, and I'm joined once again for another episode of In Defense of Virology by Simon Wain-Hobson. Simon, how are you doing today?
Hello, sir. Very well indeed, thanks. Very well.
Today like any time I talk to you, Simon, it's a very special day, but today's even more special because we're going to be talking about a couple of papers that have taken a lot of heat from myself and others that were published in the spring of 2020. One of them called Statement in Support of the Scientists, Public Health Professionals, and Medical Professionals of China Combating COVID-19, published March 7, 2020 in the Lancet. And the second paper, which is The Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2, published March 17th, 2020 in Nature Medicine. Myself and others have talked about these for years in relation to our critique that these are part of efforts by scientists and administrators to mislead the public about the origin of SARS-CoV-2. Today, Simon, you're going to talk about the science, or lack thereof, behind both of these articles, how the science presented then and how it looks today in hindsight. So whichever you'd like to start with, Simon, please go ahead.
Start with proximal origins. I've written an essay which will come out in a couple of weeks on proximal origins and Calisher, looking at it with, say, 6 years of hindsight, looking at the science as I saw it then, but also some hindsight because more data's are in and we can test some predictions or suggestions that the authors had, and I thought of too, and see how it panned out. And so we'll take proximal first. There, as everyone knows, there's the paper side and then there's the dark side, which has been amply mentioned by many writers. Notably, Gilles Demenaf has done a wonderful job and most complete analysis of proximal origins that you can imagine. It's 187 pages and it's well worth reading every single page. It's a marvelous piece of work. So we'll go into the science and then we can discuss the broader dimensions once we come out of the science. So proximal first. They say that the spike protein, which is on the surface of the molecule that binds to the receptor, they said that it was optimized binding. And of course, the immediate question is, what's optimal? What is optimal? So the strength of an interaction, say that spike, and this is the receptor, the way they fix together can be sort of lightweight and it can come apart easily, or they can be extremely strong. And this strength can vary by sometimes 1,000,000-fold for viruses. For example, flu viruses, it's very weak. And for HIV and its receptors, or coronavirus and its receptors, it's extremely strong. So once the virus has got hold of its cell, it's not going to let it go. And then it allows the virus to get inside and start producing the infection. And so they say it's optimal. Well, when something's optimal, this means it's optimal compared to something. You can't just say, oh, it's optimal. You need a comparison. This was a totally novel virus. And when that manuscript was written, they couldn't say it was optimal. They said so, it was optimized, whatever that means. But they had no reference. So that is basically speculation. You had the original strain, and then, as we know, it went through to the alpha variant that outgrew the original, the beta outgrew alpha, and so on to delta and omicron. Now, there's a paper that compared the way these different viruses bound to the receptor, and the strength of this binding varies a bit. It varies about fivefold. So from the original to alpha, it became stronger. So the very first variant that emerged had a better binding than the original one that Proximal Origins people were talking of. Yet they said it was optimized. And immediately with the first variant, nature shows us that reference that didn't exist. Well, it's variable. And we see that this binding is subordinated to the rest of the virus. It is not the dominant effect, that you can trade off the strength of this binding depending on other parameters. It is subordinated. It is not optimized. It is good. It's highly efficient. But to say it's optimized, they couldn't say that because they had no data. If these people had their ears to the grapevine and were following what was going on, there was some very early reports about the strength of this, and they might have heard through the grapevine, but there was no publication out there. And even so, it was one-off. This optimization comes back because later on in the paper, they use this optimization argument. They say, this is strong evidence that the SARS-CoV-2 is not the product of purposeful manipulation. Now, that sentence is totally unlinked to this thing about optimization because it was not optimized, that was speculation. So they are inventing, they're putting sentences together which are logically disconnected and flowing them through to spin a story. So already in terms of hardcore science, they're spinning narratives and they're bending conclusions that are not supported, not substantiated, yet they give the impression that they are substantiated. It is very incorrect science. Apart from, as I say, all the other stuff that Gilles Deminoff and US Right to Know dug up, it's very bad science. Very bad science.
This gets to kind of the dark side here, Simon, which we're trying to stay away from, which is if the goal of this paper is to convince people that this wasn't generated in a lab, then you would put that sentence in. This is strong evidence that SARS-CoV-2 is not the product of purposeful manipulation. But as you point out, what comes before that sentence is not related to
That's right.
that sentence.
There are 2 points. There is some bad science. So to say it's optimized, they couldn't say that. So that is simply bad science. Now, journalists wouldn't pick that up because they might not know what optimization means, but a virologist would. This is bad science. And then they seize any occasion to then add in behind that remark of apparent data, a narrative, which is, of course, is to say it's natural, which is the dark side, because we know they originally thought the opposite. And we'll come to the other aspect. But let's move on. The other thing they mentioned is the furin cleavage site, which is another hot topic in COVID origins, of course. They say that they anticipate that other SARS-CoV-like viruses with similar furin cleavage sites will be found in the future in other species. So I think they're thinking of bats. And so they anticipate that as we get more bat coronaviruses, we'll find furin cleavage sites. Well, no one's found them. But they certainly anticipated that we would find a furin cleavage site, and we have not.
The second paragraph doesn't end with a conclusion about whether or not this has anything to do with purposeful manipulation, unlike the first. What's noteworthy is that the first section, which doesn't have any relevance to whether there was purposeful manipulation, has a conclusion.
That was just a little parenthesis, because in the next section, which starts, and there's a subheading, Theories of SARS-CoV-2 Origins, they give you their conclusions before they've discussed the data. As a good scientist, you say, well, this is the theory. So these are the hypotheses. So lab leak or natural, okay? Discuss the data for, discuss the data against, blah, blah, blah. And then you say, while the jury may be out, the weight of evidence is. So they go straight into it, and they say it is improbable that the SARS-CoV-2 emerged through laboratory manipulation of a related SARS-CoV-like coronavirus. They actually say laboratory manipulation. Now, they didn't need to say that, and I'll explain why. In the classic gain-of-function experiments on flu, the H5N1 bird flu virus, which was adapted to become a human virus, one group did it by genetic manipulation, another did it by natural variation. Readers know that influenza viruses are mutation machines. Every round of repulation gives rise to a mutation, maybe 1 per genome, 2, occasionally 3, but every daughter genome is different to the mother genome. Subtly, 1, 2, 3 mutations. So you can do this, and Fouché did it by natural variation. If it had come from a lab, it didn't have to be manipulated. It could just be that they grew it on human cells, and it grew. I mean, they've mentioned lab manipulation, and they've said, what is it? What was the other expression? Purposeful manipulation. But they go on very quickly, and they say, if genetic manipulation had been performed. So now it's not just serial passaging. They say if genetic had been performed, and we all know this is possible, they say that it could have been by what we call a reverse genetic system. This is just jargon for saying using molecular clones to do it. Full stop at the end of that sentence. Then they say, however, the genetic data irrefutably show that SARS-CoV-2 is not derived from any previously used virus backbone. So that's a very categorical state. Irrefutably, okay, this is absolutely untruthful. They do not. They use the word irrefutable, and the data doesn't show it. And of course, there was very, very little data at the time. If you use the word irrefutable, once again, you have a hidden agenda, and you're pushing a narrative, even when you're talking about hardcore science papers. So this, you see that their analysis of science and virology is hugely biased. This is terribly bad science. They assume that what is the public record is the record, and of course it isn't. And so if the Chinese group at Wuhan had a very nice system that was working wonderfully for them, they could have generated some really nice data. I'm not saying they did, but they could have, and therefore that is another an expression that the sentences and the arguments they use are there to reinforce a narrative that they decided upon before writing. This was pushback on the lab leak. And it shows in the science and the way they choose the science words independently of what they said and the emails they sent to each other and what they said in the meeting with Jeremy Farrar and Anthony Fauci. The way they use the terms, they're inventing things, and this is very, very bad science.
We maybe should stop using the word science. It's not science, because this is use of science for like the way science was not intended. Like they're dressing up an opinion using scientific language to make people think that they've applied scientific rigor and the scientific method when in fact they haven't.
Yes, they're trying to fool people, and because this paper was so highly quoted, and when I say quoted, it probably wasn't highly quoted necessarily by the virologists. But in the early days, everyone was wanting information. Suddenly you've got this horrible thing, and it's the most obvious human question: where the hell did it come from? And what do? They spin a story. They have no data. They spin a story, and they have the balls to do this and put it down on paper in one of the very top scientific journals. It's unbelievable. Now, there have been calls for these papers to be retracted, but of course, the journals don't want to do so because it's an embarrassment to them. They say retraction has to start with the authors, but the authors aren't going to take it off because it's they don't want the shame of having to retract a paper. So everyone will resist it. But I mean, this is bad science. We know why, because there was talk of conspiracy theories, and this, when we come to the second paper, this is blunter.
You said it's bad science, but I would say it's actually, maybe we could agree it's bad for science.
Oh, it's bad science, and it's bad for science. We shouldn't be writing this sort of sloppy, illogical, and they should take their their passion and their hidden agendas out. Data is there to be interpreted and other people to confirm, and then we generate a consensus. Okay, but that's it. That's the way it is. And they have a clear narrative at every sentence, and they put things together, and they leave no chance for anyone. And if you're a journalist sort of wanting to inform their readers who are looking for a reference, they say, goodness me, there's an article in Nature Medicine, one of the top journals. I mean, it's one of the top tier in the world of scientific journals in biology. And they say, well, it must be right. So there you are, the damage is done. Nature Medicine didn't know better. Nature Medicine wanted content because everyone was asking the question. They should be retracted, but of course, I don't think these people have the courage to or the decency to do so. But it seems that way. I mean, I won't want to prejudge, but it gives that impression, certainly, yes.
I have judged multiple times the intent here, but I would push back, Simon, to say that Nature Medicine has, I actually believe that the emails and the records show that Nature and Nature Medicine have culpability in putting this out there because they themselves wanted the authors to change the paper to make it more definitive that it wasn't from a lab. That is clear from the email exchanges that the journals themselves were pushing for modifications to the manuscript to make it more definitive. So they're not passive observers here.
Oh no!
Yeah.
This comes out most clearly in the second paper.
So let's go to the second paper, which is in the Lancet, which was published March 7, 2020, called Statement in Support of the Scientists, Public Health Professionals, and Medical Professionals of China Combating COVID-19, Calisher et al. So Simon, what are your thoughts about this paper?
So they come up with a very noble thing. We stand together in strongly condemns conspiracy theories suggesting that COVID-19 does not have a natural origin. This is the second sentence. So wait a minute. They're not messing around. COVID origins, how many people, where did, and so on. They get straight to the point. Now, wait a minute. Conspiracy theories. Who is this? Well, we know that one of the very first people to do it was a distinguished virologist called Steve Bannon. Okay? Well, of course, he's not a virologist at all. Steve Bannon, we know he peddles all sorts of theories. Whether it's right or wrong is not the point. But he was one of the first to mention this. And of course, I think by that time, people were wondering, it was called the China virus. And but my question is, and this I think is the philosophical error of the authors and the journalists, why are experimental scientists bothered by conspiracy theories? Conspiracy theories are, by definition, unverifiable. And then the second thing is, do you really think that a statement in the Lancet will shut down conspiracy theories? No, they will take it and they say, look, we've provoked blood. We've got these people to say something in the Lancet. We've provoked them. We've provoked a reaction. And that's exactly what they want. Conspiracy theories, the worst thing for conspiracy theories is to be ignored. That pisses them off. But to be taken seriously, and then to have someone with all these institutions involved, this is all nonsense. If a conspiracy exists, it exists. What can you do? You just say, this is a conspiracy. There's no evidence for it. I'm sorry. And if enough people say that, and you just say it to a judge, you don't have to come out in the Lancet and say something like this.
I don't know why I was referring to this as a paper. This is just a statement.
Yeah, I tried to call it a publication because a scientific, if you call it a paper, it's as though it's been peer reviewed, it's been evaluated, and it's undergone review and modification, whatever. This is an opinion. It could be something like, an op-ed it's just an opinion, and it is their opinion. But of course, once again, They very quickly move on. They say, without any data, they said that the virus does not have a natural origin. I looked at a couple of papers that they cited. They used that as to support that statement I've just read. And I looked at them, and the data doesn't say that. So I wasn't going to run after. I think there were a total of 7 references. I read 2. They do not say that. And this is the same error in the proximal origins. So basically, they read into these things their agenda and then use those papers to say things that even those authors did not say. So this is the worst. Well, it's not science. It's sort of, this is what scientists would expect historically of journalists to do. They said, well, I spoke to someone who said this. They might not have understood it, and then everyone blames it on the journalist. These are now hardcore scientists actually peddling a theory. They are the ones spreading a conspiracy theory. They are the ones, the very first scientists to get involved in spreading misinformation in the public domain, in the hardcore science public domain, are Proximal Origins and Calisher et al. In the Lancet. They are wonderful examples of what not to do. I mean, you can't do it much worse than this. Just from the hardcore side, and apart from all the hidden agendas and the conflicts of interest, particularly in the case of Calisher et al., and so on and so forth, it's very pretentious. They say, we support the call from the Director General of WHO. Well, WHO wasn't very fast in the beginning. They say, like, this sentence really riles me. They say, we want you, so the science and health professionals of China, to know that we stand with you in your fight against this virus. Stand with our colleagues on the front line. We speak in one voice. Well, the Chinese didn't need this support. The young Chinese doctors were doing everything they could to try and save their fellow countrymen from dying of this awful disease that no one knew anything about. The intubation, they didn't know how transmissible, how it was. We know some of them died of infections of this virus. They're working there, 18-hour days, 7 days a week, absolutely exhausted. The immune system's decimated by overwork, and therefore they got the virus and probably had more severe because they were totally exhausted and died. They don't need this pontificating thing from a bunch of people in Europe and the US to say, we stand with you. They don't. Any natural person, everyone stands with you. But these scientists, to get up with this pretentious thing like that, we just wanted honesty from you. And this paper is dishonest because it says, this is a natural virus when there was no data for it. And we have to put up with this self-righteous work about, basically, I would say that the Chinese deserve better from their Western colleagues than these highfalutin sentiments, because they couldn't even write a scientific paper that was accurate and precise.
And worse, like you pointed out, that sentence that includes the 7 references that don't include the claim that they make about the origin of the virus, it's actually quite grotesque. And like you point out, it's a very striking example of putting out misinformation and doing it in a way that it looks like it has scientific basis to it, because very few people are going to look in those references. You put this large run of references, a large list of references behind a statement, and you use your scientific credential on this paper, so people are going to think that you're not playing games. Scientists should be cognizant of, if they have a statement in a paper, it should be supported.
I will go even further. It's the cornerstone of biomedicine. If you can't trust, for me, if I can't trust a colleague, then we're up shit creek, okay? If a journalist can't trust a paper published in the Lancet or Nature Medicine, then when we always like to get our science out, we like to share it and show that we do advance our agendas, and we do make progress in the war on cancer, infectious diseases, antivirals, and you name it. there's tremendous interest in from the public about what science does and discoveries in physics, astronomy, biology, virology, medicine. Virus has particular attention because of things like HIV, Ebola, and SARS. And what are we being served? We're being served opinions, hidden agendas, and this wears down trust. And some people say, well, even Bryce and Simon, who are hardcore scientists, they didn't like Proximal. Take away the dark side of these papers. They didn't like the hardcore science in there. This is not good. And therefore, In Defense of Virology, it's all about trying to sort of real speak and saying, this is what it is. This is what we can do, what we can't do. And these two papers have done huge disservice to virology.
And if you can't, so this is where some might say, we're talking about these papers 6 years later, and why can't we just move on? It's water under the bridge. Maybe people say we made mistakes. I would say that until there is a accountability, a reckoning for what was done, and the people involved in this acknowledge what these truly are, which I would say these are not science. These are propaganda pieces dressed as science.
Yes.
Why would anyone? I mean, you can't trust someone that's unable to look and have a bit of, I guess, self-reflection and say, I made this mistake. I acknowledge I made this mistake. I did harm. This is not what should happen. This until this happens, why should the scientific community really expect to be trusted when obvious examples of
sure, but let's take sort of a longer view. You can say, okay, well, at the time, no one knew these were their opinions. But then we can say, well, how did these opinions in these two papers pan out? Now that we've had 6 years to look back on it, everyone says, well, there's the lab leak and there's the natural origin, and it's not been resolved. And you would have thought that with all the world's virologists in favor of the natural origin, they would have come up with some absolutely devastatingly good arguments in favor of this. The answer is they have not. So 6 years later, we see that these papers, which are adamant, they use words like irrefutable, which is a strong word. So they were clearly, or we're being nice, giving them time, we're looking at what they said 6 years later, we gave them time. What they said has not been substantiated in the 6-year interval. Therefore, their impact at the time was hugely exaggerated, and it's unmerited.
Here's the problem I have with that, which is that when scientists have an opinion and they make it seem like that's a scientific fact, or they claim it's factual, but it's really an opinion, and then they later on say, well, it was just my opinion, when they were representing it as fact or more than opinion at the time, that's a problem. I don't see how they can say, well, whoopsie, you just took me, it was just an opinion. That if the acknowledgement that what they did was to take an opinion that was unsubstantiated and unsupported, really, a very very flimsy opinion, but dress it up as science, how are we to know that that's not happening all the time with everything else when there isn't an acknowledgement that that's what was done in this case, this extreme case where it's so obvious, like that sentence in the Lancet, like you point out, there are references that don't support the conclusions there. That's just, that can't happen. That can't happen if people are going to claim that we are scientists and carrying out the normal, logical progression of here's the evidence and here's our conclusion from the evidence based upon our best, scientific logic applied. That's where I guess I have a problem here, Simon, with the framing, which
Yes.
is that sure, we can just take, if they operated in good faith back then yes, the science didn't hold up, and that's where we are today.
Okay,
But they weren't. So what do we do with that?
So we can say, well, as a scientist, you have the right to be wrong. No one's perfect. Science is incredibly tough because you're up against questions that no one has asked before, and you're always a chance of being wrong. But therefore, you have to be sort of a bit modest. So the first thing in these papers was these very powerful use of words like irrefutable when there was no data. So that basically was not, they oversold their case. Why did they do it? I think I think it's actually very simple. Very simple. And we saw this in gain of function. They were shit scared that this could have been either an engineered virus, because we know that gain of function experiments were being done in Wuhan, which is clearly papers from 2015 and 2017. We know this. And they were shit scared that this could have been a crack-up. Didn't mean to say it was, but it could have been. And then behind that is, they said, God, if this is true, science and virology, aka my field, is going to take a pummeling. And then next step after that is, then who shoulders responsibility? So they're thinking of fear, punishment, and therefore you move into denial, deflect, diffuse, and everything follows from that point. And it's the same in gain of function. Now, there wasn't a lab leak of those viruses. There was a lab accident, but it didn't go anywhere.
You're talking about the flu, the souped-up flu strains? You mean?
Flu, but it's the same thing that if that one of those viruses had escaped and set up a pandemic, what would we say to our bosses? What would we say to the community? Virology would take a pummeling. Funding would tank. Funding for biomedical research in general, nothing to do with viruses, that would tank because of loss of trust. So, deny, deflect, diffuse. The same fears in COVID origins and gain of function research. In case of COVID origins, there's the fear that it was. In the case of gain of function, that never occurred, fortunately. But the danger was there. People saw the fear and the threat to science, and therefore they went into denial mode and sort of saying, this is madness, we should stop this. And then we can show not only that we're responsible, we're ethically responsible, we're morally responsible, and when things go wrong or they go awry, or in the case of gain of function, they're going down the wrong path, even though no accident occurred, we take steps and stop it. So it was the gain of function was in some ways, if it had been stopped on the spot, and the NIH had taken the high road, it would have been wonderful responsibility and good scientific practice for the NIH, and instead they went into the denial. We're right, we know what we're doing. An op-ed in the Washington Post, which by the way is an opinion. We've talked about Calisher as an opinion. It's an opinion in the Washington Post, a flu risk worth taking. We will give an opinion, which was not disproven by the science subsequently. The H5N1 has not become a pandemic in humans. Dr. Karaoke, who was the lead author on one of those papers, has actually written that he doesn't think H5N1 is a threat for humans. And on all registers, even the cow H5N1, which was an infection that came from birds, the CDC considered it very low risk for humans.
This gets to the accountability that opinion was proven it didn't work out, but there has been no acknowledgement from the authors of that piece that they were wrong, which would be of use, I think, to say, hey, we wrote this over 10 years ago. It turned out that this opinion didn't work out, or something like that.
Yeah,
Would that help?
Yeah, I don't know if this helps listeners, but I mean, scientists are they're full of opinions, and they get worked up about what their own opinions, and they will criticize their colleagues, and maybe they're not critical enough of their own work. But so long as there's a sort of a best attempt to get towards a solution using experimental data, then that you can be wrong. Well, that happens. In fact, being wrong is rather good, because you say, well, I got that messed up, and you sort of analyze your thoughts, and you realize how you can make mistakes or miss things. This happens. Doing science is incredibly difficult. It's not just a salary job. It's more the creative side is the artistic spirit. But what we see in Calisher et al. And its proximal origins is a total disregard for the quality of fact and the building in of a narrative which apparently disproves a scientific hypothesis, and there was no data for it. And that is a failing. They went overboard to disprove something without good data. I mean, when I say without good data, I mean it's appalling, the interpretation of the data. I mentioned that both papers cite a certain couple of papers saying the data irrefutably show, well, the paper do not irrefutably. Therefore, they are manipulating other people's publications to their ends. And that's why those papers are deeply questionable. And that's why they should be retracted. But to be wrong in science, I think once you get to a certain age, you've always done something that didn't pan out, or you got the wrong, you got the thin end of the wedge, and you missed something because I were.
But that was when you're acting in good faith. That's doing it, like if you're doing it the right way.
Exactly.
This
Sorry,
and there's
that's a word, it's a phrase.
That's the difference.
Good faith is good. If you're doing good faith, you can be wrong. People say, yeah, well, to use that wonderful phrase from Jack Lemmon, nobody's perfect, right? Well, fine, right. But here, there was clearly manipulation of the narrative, choosing and adding words which were not substantiated. And that is why those papers are distinct from a paper getting wrong. And by the way, for listeners, if a paper is wrong, it's not retracted. People in the field say, well, we all know that his paper is wrong for this risk. And it is in some ways, it's a reference of showing how things can go wrong. It's very tough science. And these are wrong because of the manipulation, the intent to tell a story that is not substantiated. That is the reasons why they should be retracted.
Yes, I completely agree. So, Simon, is anything else that you want to say to wrap this up?
Yes, I would. I would like to say, and there's a very interesting sentence at the end of Proximal Origins, and it says, in the midst of the global COVID pandemic, it is reasonable to wonder why the origins of the pandemic matter. And it comes from the proximal origins. So basically saying, yes, as we all want to know why. So if people speculate about the origins, lab leak or otherwise, it's reasonable. In the words of proximal origins, it's reasonable. What was unreasonable about proximal origins is they immediately wanted to shut down one of the major hypotheses. So they shot themselves in the foot. So you can say now, so what is the role or the responsibility of journals? It's clear that for the authors, they wrote a narrative that was not substantiated by data. In fact, what they corralled as data was just nonsense. What is the role of the journals? And the journals basically seem to be a law unto themselves. Well, actually, this is not exactly true. There's something called the Intra-Academy Panel Statement on Biosecurity. It's an international organization of the academies of sciences from at least 60 countries around the world. And they wrote a statement about the ethics or the reasons about doing science. The first of 5 points is do no harm, which is interesting. I have an essay on this, and I won't bother listeners with this right now. The important point is the fifth on oversight. And if I may, just read this sentence. Scientists with responsibility for oversight of research or for evaluation of projects, that you think immediately of the NIH, or publications, the journal, should promote adherence to these principles, these 5 principles, by those under their control, supervision, or evaluation, and act as role models in this regard. Though that sentence was signed off upon by the US National Academy of Sciences. You can't get more establishment. The sad point about this is the establishment, because that information was not made public. They didn't get the message out. They didn't try to say, well, here we have 60 academies around the world who've agreed on this. You should know this, that you have an obligation of being a scientist to do no harm, and that the journals involved. They signed a feel-good statement to cover them, but they didn't get the message out. So we see the cynicism. They protect themselves from criticism and say, yes, the principles, oversight, do no harm, we're there, give us the money and everything. And what do? Nothing. Nothing. And they clearly, if it's do no harm, then this would have put a stop to gain of function research. And if the NIH had known about it, they would have known. They would have probably stopped it. You cannot imagine the number of people who do not know about this. I've asked US Academy members, I've asked members of the French Academy of Sciences, no one knew. The UK Royal Society who signed this, they didn't know. I've met a few people in the US, a few Academy members. I think it's maybe 3 or 4 out of hundreds and hundreds. Most did not know about it. The establishment wants to have all the perks and privileges of doing biomedical science and talking up a new discovery for Alzheimer's or cancer or some genetic disease with these poor kids that have tremendous problems because some rare mutation that makes their life hell. But when things don't go quite so right, it's under the carpet. And it's not my responsibility, it's someone else's. And everywhere it's deflect, diffuse, and deny.
Well, as I said frequently online, and perhaps not here yet, but without accountability, nothing changes. Until we have people held accountable for decisions they make that actually cause harm, then we won't necessarily see changes. But and I do think this principle of do no harm is applicable when you're talking about putting statements in papers that you know to be unsound and deliberately misleading. That is activity that causes harm.
Deliberately misleading causes harm. It's not physical harm, but it's sort of it's cerebral harm, and therefore it's sort of a form of it's intellectual dishonesty. Yeah, and that causes harm. There's no question. There's no question.
I will end it there, Simon. Thanks again for joining me on another episode of In Defense of Virology. My name is Bryce Nickels, and until next time, take care, everybody.